Good evening, everyone. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Remnants of Mid-Century Toronto, a virtual discussion. Thank you for joining us this evening and for this virtual event. My name is Leslie Thompson. I'm a volunteer board member on the board of directors of Heritage Toronto. Heritage Toronto is a charity and an agency of the City of Toronto that celebrates our city's rich heritage and the diverse stories of its people, places, and events. Through our programs, which include tours, plaques, State of Heritage Report, and online exhibits, we engage the public to reflect on the past, both to make sense of our present and to inform the future. Before we begin tonight's program, I'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement. Although we are gathered virtually in this evening, for this event, Heritage Toronto's offices are located on the traditional territory of the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and Anishinaabe, including the Chippewas and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, Toronto is host to many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. Toronto is within the territory of the Dish with One Spoon Treaty, which includes responsibility of those who use the land to share it peaceably and to care for it. Heritage Toronto acknowledges this responsibility and recognizes the efforts of these nations in maintaining the land. We have much to learn from them. I am very excited to introduce our program this evening. It's a virtual discussion inspired by the recent book, Remnants of Mid-Century Toronto, which documents the sometimes beautiful and sometimes neglected collection of mid-century structures that still stand today, dotting Toronto's urban landscape. Now, I'd like to present our panelists for this evening's discussion. First, the photographer of Remnants of Mid-Century Toronto, Vik Pahwa. Vik is an architectural photographer specializing in documenting Toronto's built environment with an emphasis on mid-century modernism. His photographs have appeared in Toronto, Architecture, A City Guide, Modest Hopes, This Brutal World, and numerous spacing magazines. Vik is also a film locations photographer and has run a daily architecture photography blog at vikpahwa.com for almost 11 years. Next is Matthew Blackett. Matthew is a publisher, creative director, and one of the founders of Spacing Magazine. He is also a graphic artist, product designer, and deeply committed advocate for Toronto. If you subscribe to the magazine, you know that this is really quite true. As publisher, Matthew has helped shape Spacing into one of Canada's top small magazines. He was named Editor of the Year for 2007 by the Canadian Society of Magazine Editors, and Spacing has been named Canadian Small Magazine of the Year 6 times. He's the author, editor, and photographer of 10 books. And finally, our moderator for the evening is Philip Evans. Philip is a principal at ERA Architects and the founder of Culture of Outports. Over the course of 17 years, he has led a range of conservation, adaptive reuse, design, and feasibility planning projects. He works both in the office and in the field and has practiced on either side of the Atlantic. He's worked in a range of built environments, including urban, suburban, and rural settings. Before I hand things over to the panelists, a reminder that the panelists will be taking some questions from the audience. If you wish to submit a question, please use the Q&A feature, not the general chat window. You can usually find the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window. You're welcome to submit questions at any point during the event, which the panelists will answer at the end of their presentation. This event also features live transcription and closed captioning. You can turn the captioning on or off using the button at the bottom of your screen or in your general Zoom settings. One final note that this webinar is being recorded. The full recording will be made available on Heritage Toronto's YouTube channel. in the next several weeks. Heritage Toronto staff are also on hand to help with any tech-related issues. And now I'd like to hand things over to Vik, Matthew, and Philip.
Thank you, Leslie, and thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. I want to just open up with a bit of a couple of comments before I hand it off to Matt to give us a bit of an overview on the book, and then we'll jump into some questions that we have. And we actually just want to encourage everybody, please engage with us, ask away, lots of questions. Hopefully this becomes a lively and fun debate. This is a topic that is obviously quite a bit of interest to all of us. Again, thank you, Leslie, Matt, and Vik for having me participate this evening. Just as to everybody, I encourage you to pick up a copy of your Remnant Toronto book. I think before we jump into it, I actually just want to take a moment to express my interest as a member of ERA in this subject in the book, and as a building conservationist. At ERA, we're super keen in understanding how to best document, conserve, and manage modernist buildings. To see a book like this, Matt and Vik, is just wonderful. We understand and appreciate the effort that goes into it. It's huge, and it's a big offering to many of us city builders. It's in some ways, I've always been a bit moved by the idea that the modernist influence on this city had actually in some way paved the way for early heritage and building conservation movements here in Ontario and in Toronto. And I specifically think about what a response to, in fact, the response to Mises TD Towers in the late 60s, and the demolition of the bank building that anchored the corner of Bay and King at that time. To imagine that, how many years later now, 60 years plus later, that our collective efforts as city builders, still trying to figure out how to best protect and manage the very buildings that were responsible for replacing some of these earlier eras is it's kind of ironic, but this is an evolving practice and field that we're all building up together. So I also had to say, just on a high level, conserving modernist buildings becoming a more regular occurrence in our practice, and I think by the shared communities, it's something that we do, in fact, engage in many conversations throughout the city. And again, I would just say that we're still trying to figure out what it means to preserve, to manage, and rehabilitate these buildings. And we'll get into that a little bit more. But again, what an incredible documentation, Matt and Vik, and really appreciate the insights that you both could bring forward here. And again, thanks for letting us participate in this.
Thanks, Phil. That's a great introduction. I'm going to share my screen here for viewers. Let's see here. Vik and Phil, you can see that nicely. Okay, so that's good. So that means others can. Hold on here. Let me go back. Okay. Thank you all for coming. For a number of you, I don't really know what you know about spacing, so I'm going to give you a little bit of a quick rundown. We're obviously a magazine about Toronto. We've been around since 2003, almost 18 years. Hey, Vik, can you turn off your mic or mute yourself for a sec? There we go. So yeah, we've been around since 2003. We publish quarterly, and we write about urban issues in Toronto, urbanism issues in Toronto. And since 2015, we've also been doing book publishing. And so let's see here. The book that you that we're talking about tonight, Remnants of Mid-Century Toronto, is part of a series of books that we started putting out in 2019, just before the pandemic started. This is a book that I did about the beautiful mess of Toronto laneways. It's pretty much a photography book of garages in a battle with nature and modernity and nature in a battle. We also came out with Package Toronto, which is this is a book where myself and Wayne Reeves and a handful of our writers scoured the city of Toronto's museum collection and tried to find packaging that was made here in Toronto. So not like manufactured, designed, everything, and it was reflective of our city. And in fact, in this book, we can kind of see that there is a bit of an aesthetic that was created out of Toronto. And this is our most recent book. This just released last week, or it just arrived, and it's a focus. It's the same type of thing as Package Toronto, but we scoured the city of Toronto's museum collection for unique Toronto sports souvenirs, and we pulled out hundreds of them, and then showed them to our writers, and those writers got to write stories inspired by those souvenirs. And of course, this book that we're here to discuss tonight, Remnants of Mid-Century Toronto, is part of this series. It came out in the summer of 2020. Vik and I had been working on it for a year, and along with Julie Fish, our designer. I was to kind of just to back this up and tell you a little bit about the book and how it kind of came about. I was part of a Toronto Urban Design Award jury, and I was being driven around the city to view new buildings and public spaces. But when we're passing through areas, suburban areas of Toronto, a fellow jury member, Marianne McKenna, said something to me like, "You really do like buildings with a folded plate roofline." I couldn't tell if she was teasing me or being just observant, but she was spot on. The places I was pointing out, places like Northminster United Church at Finch and Bathurst, or Downsview Arena on Wilson, or the CFTO studio in Agincourt, all of them contain some sort of a zigzag roof line, and they all, for some reason, were very evocative for me. This has to do with the fact that I grew up in Willowdale in North York, and I traveled through the Toronto inner suburbs during the 70s and 80s, playing a lot of hockey. Like my daily life mostly took place inside buildings built during the post-war economic boom, schools, cultural venues, and hockey rinks. The house I grew up in for the first 22 years of my life, bungalow built in the backyard of the area's original farmhouse. It was built in 1967. So mid-century Toronto seems to be kind of deep in my bones. When I moved downtown to the Annex in the 90s, I discovered a fantastic modern collection of apartments nearby on Walmer. There were, round buildings with sculptural, space age inspired entrances and flared bell-bottom retaining walls. It was during these walks that the seeds of appreciation for modern architecture was planted in me. Let me. So that's a nice. It's a good example. One of those fantastic entrances. It wasn't until I started spacing in 2013 with some colleagues that I truly got an education in modern Toronto. One of the most important contacts, I think some of the most important contacts that I made were in those early days of the magazine were with Michael McClellan and Graham Stewart and Phil Evans, our moderator tonight at the Area Architects. through them and ERA staff, I was exposed to like the importance of residential tower communities, the disdain many residents felt towards modern architecture, and the cultural heritage that was imbued in some of these structures. Ironically, as Phil said, this is kind of the attitude is no different than how modernists felt about old 19th century and early 20th century architecture in the city. So that collaborative spirit between spacing ERA still exists today, and a fair amount of the writing that you find in this book came from folks at ERA. And it was through spacing that I met a photographer and fellow panelist here, Vik. Over the years, Vik and I have spent, hold on one sec here. There we go. Give you a nice view. Over the years, Vik and I have spent time debating the kind of cultural and social significance of these buildings that are mostly unknown and underappreciated. And when Torontonians discuss build heritage, you're usually thinking about 19th and 20th century structures, early 20th century structures, and mid-century architecture and heritage are really rarely spoken together. It was a probably the most important phase in development of both architecture and the city's own growth was during the mid-century, and a great number of buildings have already been lost. So when Vik and I set out to do this book, we specifically made sure that it didn't become a best of mid-century architecture. Instead, we wanted to focus on the remnants of this era, of the buildings and structures see in our everyday activities that are often blend into the background of our kind of collective memories of the city. Seeing these buildings in a contemporary setting, so Vik's photographs today that were built with the ethos of a totally different generation, kind of allows us to reflect on the legacy of what we've inherited at the city. And we wanted to create this book to help residents gain kind of a greater appreciation of the most important, we think, an impactful period of development in Toronto's history. And we hope it adds another layer to the city's rich history. We inside the book, it's got some lovely full page, double page spreads of Vik's work. We split it. I'm just going to show it off. I'm going to show you here a little bit. We split it into like a number of like categories. So we talk about like residential buildings. Here's Briar Hill. We talked about civic and cultural buildings. This is Eglinton West Station, and this is the Ontario Court of Justice on Jarvis. We talk about schools. Public schools are some of the greatest, I think, modern architecture that we have in the city. This is in Little Italy. And sometimes they get neglected, as you can see at this kind of fine example of a school, but it's a lovely pole in the middle of the courtyard there. And then places of worship, obviously are a fantastic example of modern architecture. The changing views of the Catholic Church, especially in the 1960s, impacted how churches were built, and in synagogues and temples and mosques and all those types of places. And then we also dealt with infrastructure, so places like the TTC, or you see great expressions of there's air vents at Bathurst and Dundas West. I think that's Toronto Western there. And then we also have a section on brutalism. You can't talk about modern Toronto or Toronto mid-century Toronto without some nice big gray buildings. So it kind of gives you like an overview of exactly what we wanted to do as what our motivations were for the book, and what's inside it.
Great, Matt. Thanks so much. Those are some pretty powerful images, and I do note the benefit of having the grouping of types, building types throughout the book. And there seems to be, I can't help but think there's a commentary on these sort of civic assets in the kind of organization of these books. I hadn't thought about that until your overview. Can you speak for a second just on maybe the value of that approach? I think there are many great examples throughout the city of modernist buildings of various scales, but you're actually dealing with a very specific kind of scale and level of permanence here that maybe speak to a reason why they're in fact remnants.
Well, you know, you can see that like places like the residential towers are you know they're meant for young single people when they were built, and so it was a middle class thing and a step up to upper middle class, and it's become a much different an animal than that, so I think that's what I think that's really interesting too, is just how some of these places had original ideas of what they were going to be about, and they become something totally different. But then I chose them, we organized them into these kind of sections because I think they're like kind of the best examples of kind of what is left. You know, if you go to Bayview Village or some of these places that have nice modern residential architecture, that's great, but they've been kept up, right? And so I was more interested in what we see and just kind of pass by in our daily lives. You know, I could have just done strip malls as a category as well. There's many different ways that we could have organized this, but you know, this was a good way of kind of just talking about some of the are imbued in these places, whether it's the culture or its meaning or its function. I think it was kind of important to kind of cover off kind of the impact, the different kind of places that this architecture and this type of approach to city building covered.
Great. Vik, there's a couple of questions that are coming in about a little bit about your process in taking photographs. One question is around maybe what your biggest challenge is in photographing these buildings, whether you're using a perspective control lens. Can you give us a sense about like how you do what you do?
Sure. First, I want to
maybe I'm just curious, is it any different photographing a modernist building than say some of the other features in your portfolio?
Okay. First, I just want to say thanks for being part of the seminar with me. It's a real privilege to be with Spacing and ERA. You're both two of my biggest influences when it comes to modern architecture. Without the magazine and without that archive of North York modernism or Concrete Toronto by ERA architects, I don't know how far I would have got. To be perfectly honest, there's not much of a process. Well, there is now, but for a while there, it really came down to having a pair of comfortable shoes and a Presto card. Being mobile is very important, so I carry one camera, one lens, an all-purpose lens, so I don't invest too heavily in technology. Nowadays, I've got more of a process. I'm now mapping where I've been, what I've shot, where things are. I'll try to bring up an example here. I can't seem to get it up right now, but I've just basically wandered randomly. I pick a direction, and I see what inspires me. I know it doesn't sound very formal, but it's really just a stream of consciousness type way of proceeding. And I really love it. It's my favorite thing to do, is to walk down the street and see a new that I haven't seen before. It has a lot of the same elements as other buildings, but there's something that's different about it, something within the limits of modernism that's new. And what happens is, as you cumulatively shoot many buildings, you start to notice patterns and correlations between buildings. And that inspires me even further to take more shots. I often approach this from a subject point of view. I think I started wandering around more seriously when I volunteered to do a bunch of a slideshow for ACO Toronto. They were looking at schools, and they were doing a symposium about saving school architecture. So I started wandering the city, taking pictures of schools. I've got about 400 of the TDSB schools done. There's still another 200 to go. And so you go through phases. First it was schools, then I really got into modern churches, and then transformer homes. This is all from the mid-century era. Another big influence would have been my film locations photography. I shoot for the Ontario. The goal of this organization is to bring more film to the city, and there's now $2 billion of film industry here. So I think we're doing a good job, but that's afforded the ability to take pictures from unusual vantage points or to get access to that are difficult to get to. But now I'm more focused on finishing each of these building types that I've started. It's no easy feat covering the entire city. It takes a lot of work, takes a lot of planning, and it takes up a lot of time. So I try to get out every day. It's sunny and nice, and there's time to proceed.
That's great, Vik. And actually, I just a follow-up question to that. In the collaboration between you and Matt on this project, I mean, were there? Did you get the photos first and then decide which buildings to feature, or Matt, was it a little was it the other way around, or was it a bit of a process there?
For us, Vik has a fantastic archive on his website. And so part of it was going through and just picking photos off his website. That was part of, I think, great about this project, is that I didn't have to go assign Vik, hey, go take photographs of this and that. Right. I think there might have been a few things that you did, but it was very limited. It was more along the lines of, oh, do you have a photograph of this building? And and there was a few occasions where Vik hadn't actually posted anything, but he did have something in his archive. So like the mapping and the kind of like metadata that he's kind of embedded into his website has been really helpful. And you can actually see his photos now. Vik's photos are now in the Toronto archives too. So if you're looking up some buildings, you're going to start finding Vik's photos in. So he's leaving a bit of a legacy behind of images just by sheer volume. So, Vik, can I ask you, sorry, how many photos do you take of, like, if you're on site and you're taking a photograph of a building, how many different photographs would you take, or how many different angles would you take?
It depends on the scenery, depends on the sun, depends on how much time I have, if there's people around, cars. But if I get a chance, I'll circle a building fully and try to take pictures from all sides, zoomed in shots, shot from a distance, close-ups of detail here and there. So for each building, I might have a dozen to 20 shots. So some of them are better than others. I just choose the one I like most for the blog, which is what you look at on the website. Sometimes you have to go back more than once. Some of the pictures, as you may see, are on cloudy days, so it might be good to return for some sun. If you went in the afternoon, it might turn out that the morning was the best time to shoot. So it's an ongoing process. And with the map I have logos, little logos saying what I need to do at each location. A certain color might stand for shoot in the another one might say go back and revisit, even though you have a photo. So if it's going to be published or something, I often try to go back and revisit just to make sure I haven't missed anything.
Great. Vik, there are a number of great questions that are coming in that are directed at you or Matt. And I'll just jump through a couple. What building is on the front cover? This one here.
That's the Toronto District School Board West Education Office. It's right next to the Etobicoke Civic Center. This is their internal lobby taken from an elevated, from the stairwell.
Okay.
This is one of the best brutalist buildings in Toronto, in my opinion. It's just as astounding on the outside as it is on the inside.
Truly is. And then there's a question here, and it's around which building was a happy discovery, one that wasn't on your list when you first set out, but was something that you stumbled upon. Any happy surprises?
It's within the book.
Yeah,
Sure.
or not.
Okay. I would consider almost every church in there a happy surprise.
Right.
It's exhilarating when you first come up to these things because they're spectacular, they're sculptural, they're beautiful, there's elements that are not used on any other building type. There's something about worship that really brings out the best in architecture. Another recent find was, this one's not in the book, but it comes to mind, is the hospital at, I think, Bathurst and Finch area. There's a brutalist hospital up there, which is just, yes.
It was formerly Branson. It was closed recently, I think.
And the other one, I know this is not answering the question directly, but in 2011, they started demolishing all the, I guess, the apartment buildings by Peter Dickinson in Regent Park. And I'd already seen it there. The demolitions were mind-blowing, but extremely sad at the same time. That was a huge thing there as well. I'm still finding buildings all the time. It doesn't matter how far out you go into the edges of the city, there's something to be seen everywhere.
That was great. And another question, Vik, around, do you have any models of inspiration for you, other urban photographers that that are inspirational in some way? Your work, the comment here is, your work reminds me of Eugene Jet, documentation of Paris in the early 20th century. And thank you for that comment. That's a nice.
That's a very good question. I wish I could remember names better. I know there was a couple of photographers, I think they were brothers maybe, in the 30s, and they just, I guess they shot in a way that I'm shooting. They went and they would cover water towers, for example, and then shoot every single water tower and put it together in a kind of feature of water towers. I wish I could remember names. There's one other guy that comes to mind, and that's Gabriel. I don't know if you can see this, Gabriel Basilico. He's a black and white photographer, lots of facades, great angles. This book really blew my mind. So I would say this guy was a huge influence, especially in the last 3 or 4 years.
Great. Matt, were there any perspectives or entries that surprised you, whether it was in the reoccurring themes, appreciating Vik's enjoyment of photographing some of the modernist churches, which are just spectacular, and anecdotally probably some of the most vulnerable, specifically vulnerable resources that we're aware of in our practice to be a church, let alone a modernist church. But any surprises there for you?
Well, I'll say this as a raging atheist, I really do love modernist churches. They are fantastic, and I feel kind of similar to Vik. Walking up to them often, it's like there's a lot of really good details. My wife's family grew up in Ottawa, and there's an area called Elmvale Acres. and Pleasant Park and Alta Vista, this area, and it really reminiscent of where I grew up in Toronto. It's built around the same time and has just a fantastic collection of churches. So I've spent weekends walking around Ottawa, just photographing those things. I think through churches, I think was learning about how the Catholic Church in the 1960s decided to change the way they were going to interact with their parishioners, right? Instead of looking forward, they were going to turn and look at the parishioners. It was going to not be in Latin. It was going to be in English. It was like there was a whole idea that they were competing with television, modern society, and that the churches were reflective of that. And you can see that trickle down into all different types of places of worship as well too. So I was really kind of that was something I wouldn't have known with it, besides kind of digging into this kind of stuff. And the thing probably that I like going through Vik's photos that I kind of discovered or started to see as a theme was the use of color in subtle but use of fun color in the modern schools, and it probably in paneling. That was really kind of fun to see. You kind of only see it when you start to kind of flip through and you start to see it's in the window panes or the paneling or those types of things. So there's some fun like details like that. And I'll just say what I think is like I'm not trying to toot our horn too much, but I think what's great about this book as well, it's like very photographic heavy. Our contributors give lots of little details about things like glazed bricks and oh geez, why am I blanking on things now? Yeah, Uno Pre, or the kind of the spaceship entrances, or why there is folded plate zigzag roofs, things like that. And so there's a little bits of details to kind of give you a few more layers of knowledge about the city, its history, and its architecture.
No, there's a question in the chat here, and I promise you guys I wouldn't do this, put you on the spot and ask you for your favorite mid-century building, but someone's poked this line of questioning, and they want to know where you would rate the crossways at Dundas West and Bloor among Toronto's brutalist architecture.
I find that to be a really great building. As far as whether it's brutalist or not, I suppose that's debatable. I mean, it's brick, but it has a lot of the bulky features of brutalist buildings. I do like it. Vantage points are really good on that building. I give it a thumbs up.
I'm really partial to the Briar Hill apartments. Just some of like the and kind of the spacing, the siting of them, and just some of the details. They haven't been kept up very well, but again, it's like you drive up Bathurst and Avenue Road and some of those areas, and there's some you see the kind of the old city and the mid-century city kind of butting up and together, and I think that's pretty fun. I've also loved this. Recently came. I had never been in the area around the Queensway and Park Lawn, the kind of northeast of it, and it's a giant collection of mid-century mid-rise buildings. I think there's about 45 buildings that are 3, 4, 5 stories tall that are all collected there. It was a former kind of like industrial zone, and that's someplace I've recently just started to kind of explore, because it's very much of that kind of modernist ideal, like kind of like, oh, these really nice spaces between buildings are all going to kind of come together. It's like a little garden city ideas creeping into it. And it was, what I also find really interesting too is that was a Metro project, and so Metro was building a lot of housing at the time, and those houses, it's something that like the city is getting in the way a fair bit, or maybe the Ontario government's getting in the way a fair bit of building new housing. And I think that's kind of what's one of the kind of the reminders now of what the modernist era gave us, or the mid-century era gave us was they gave us a lot of housing, and there was a lot of mechanisms to build a lot of that housing, and not always the best housing, not always the best plans, but I think there were obviously some very good policies to increase the housing stock at the time and vary it as well.
You know what, that's such an important and incredible comment of the era, and just the big social investment that was being made. And I think, again, that's pretty clear in the collection of buildings that are being profiled in the book. You know, we're as a group of city builders, we're trying to address a lot of issues, problems right now in our cities, in our communities. What would you say do you hope to think that we would see more of the fine examples of affordable housing, or some of the housing examples that are in the book? Do you think we'll lose something that was only so specific of the modernist era as a building type, as a building form? Do you see that less and less now? And maybe, Vik, your earlier point about churches, maybe, and Matt, we're probably that's a use that's dwindling. Do you have any thoughts around that?
Well, you can clearly see in our mid-rise buildings, the policy, like modern mid-rise buildings, they take a lot of cues from those buildings from the 60s and the 70s that you find in the inner suburbs. You find them in Old City of Toronto as mostly infill kind of places. Jameson would probably be the biggest collection of them. There's some places clearly, St. Jamestown that is the biggest collection of those things, but of towers, but of like those kind of mid-rise buildings for sure. So we're seeing some of the good elements, I think, of that. I don't know if I have answers to some of what else you're addressing there, but
no, I think that's I would agree with you. I think housing is still something that we continue to invest in, and it's still a need in the city, and with the still continued investments in how we move around this city. There were some big policy ideas in Toronto's last official plan around, let's locate people where there's transit-oriented density. And I think many of us are feeling the effects of that over the last decade or so. What doesn't work, those are very different, or maybe the same continued challenges that the modernists were having to grapple with from that period. I can say that beyond what larger city building issues or challenges that the modernist folks builders were taking on, what we've noticed in our work is to manage these resources, to note that these designers, they were in pursuit of something that was very different from their predecessors. How you build a modern building is distinctly very different from how we built three white brick warehouse buildings, or Victorian house of the turn of the last century. The building system advancements, how to deal with HVAC and cooling. These were like cutting edge technologies of the day. There was quite a few experiments, experience in materials, in construction techniques, the exploration of forms and the philosophies that they were chasing, very different from the period prior, and continue to be something very quite unique of the period. So I think I would agree with you that there are still many social economic challenges we're still trying to overcome in the city that might still be left over from that period. But it's a bit of an experiment. It's a learning curve. So
I wanted to add that as far as details go, one thing I worry about is in the modern high rises, where all these people live. I think up to 1 million people live there. We're at 60 years for a lot of these buildings. And if you walk around the city, you'll see that balconies are being replaced, railings are being replaced. Some people do a really good job of replacing and adding elements that pay homage to the modern architecture. Other times it seems to be just whatever goes. So as far as little details go, I think that's one example that's really important. It's not hard to use new contemporary materials and still kind of give off the modernist vibe.
Yeah, I would agree with that, particularly, you know, Vik. And I have to say, you know, you're many of the photographs you are picking up on, you know, materials and, you know, window systems. They're still in use. They're still standing 60 years later. Will modern contemporary building materials stand that test of time as well? And I appreciate many changes in the building code, many changes in the way that the profession, you know, now builds. But there is something to be said about it. And those are the kinds of challenges we're all facing when a, you know, beautiful slick piece of, you know, anodized copper flashing, which they don't quite make the same profiles anymore. They're a little different. It was a sacrificial piece for the original design. Those are the kinds of things that get replaced in an envelope kind of system, as opposed to, you know, the structure you see is actually the structure that is expressed on the outside of the building. In some cases, contending with, you know, what is the right move, what is the right replacement, how to keep in line with modern, again, building code expectations. You can't have railings climbable anymore, like maybe you could back in the day, right? So these are the kinds of features that, you know, Matt, to your point earlier about the zigzag shapes and the folding, I wonder if there are some modernist forms that will have just fallen out of fashion, or just fallen out of our sense of, you know, urban context, that we just won't see anymore. And maybe that's unfortunate as well as urban conditions. I'm just going to check out some of these other questions. Vik, you're getting a lot of questions around, you know, what advice do you have for new photographers? And, you know, in your photographic walks, what other stories are you gathering from residents or occupants of the buildings? You must have some interesting encounters along in your process.
Certainly, there are definitely encounters, more so than, hey, what are you taking a picture of me? Stop that. There's other encounters for sure. Just the other day, I was looking at some modern buildings in Mimico on the waterfront, and the gentleman who lives there really loves Art Deco, and he's made the entrances Art Deco. The residents of the apartment building take great pride in the place. So someone saw me outside and they welcomed me in and said to look around. So that kind of thing happens every so often. Once I was shooting a modern school. The principal saw me shooting, came out and said, what do you think you're doing? And she was very nice and invited me inside to see how the building was shaped inside while the kids were in class. So that was really special. I've also had, you know, the opposite thing where, you know, you visit a school and you have your camera out and people take offense. So it runs the gamut from one thing to the other. I wish I had more time to do more interior photography and to talk to more people, certainly.
That's great. There's a couple of comments here. One comment about the shock of some of the apartment or new condo build users would be shocked to see the size of the apartments from the 60s and 70s. And actually, what I find interesting about that, at some point, someone's going to do a fun study about mapping, in fact, the change in scale and size and functionality of a residential unit. And I can think of a few examples from just after the turn of the last century, New York style apartments, switching up into apartments of the 30s and 40s, maybe some frugal, more conservative ideas about what is required for living, and then of the modernist era and the explosion of comers to the city in response to that, and just the big investment at the time, what modern living, contemporary living was like, and that how that might be flexible, might be very different from what people are experiencing with contemporary ideas about what's required to have a living space. Have either, Matt, I've never asked you, have either of you lived in any of these modernist apartments in?
Yeah, I lived on a 24-story 1964 apartment building on Jameson, at the foot of Jameson and Lakeshore. And it was actually a pretty small space, but I had friends that had like a 2-bedroom, and it was spacious for a 2-bedroom, and I saw a 3-bedroom in there, and it was giant. And in fact, there had been people that had lived in there so long that they actually owned their unit. So they had made a deal with previous owners to own the unit that they actually had. They paid like 30 grand for it in like 1984 or something. They still lived in it. So yeah, there's some of those places are pretty amazing. I know also some occasionally, so we do this thing with the spacing store where after the guaranteed mailing dates that Canada Post gives of December 15th, when you place an order, it's going to be shipped or mailed out. You got to do it before something like the 15th of December. So what we do is we have a special service where I drive around the city for a day delivering for a small fee, delivery fee. I deliver all the packages, and that was really fun. There's a fantastic modern, and so I did that the last 2 years. And last year, or not this past December, but the previous December, there's a fellow that lives on 4th Avenue it's in Swansea, and backs into like a valley there, and had like a modernist, unbelievable, like rounded building that goes down into the valley there, and invited me in and showed me all around his house, and it was almost a complete circle, and it was just unbelievable. So kind of like Vik, if you get the right opportunities and people trust you enough, and they'll invite you in and want to kind of show you some of those kind of special places.
I personally live in a postmodern insignificant building. I've never really had the opportunity to live in a modernist place, but I have seen some beautiful houses through my film locations work that are entirely astounding.
Wait, Vik, the glazed brick that you've got behind you there, that's in the postmodern apartment building that you've got?
No, that's not my building. That's a picture from the book, actually. It's glazed alternating brick from Avenue Road. I also wanted to mention what little secret that I used to use. I don't know if I should reveal this or not, but I used to go to real estate open houses to get a lot of my photos. And you'd be amazed at how real estate agents are. You say, hey, can I take a picture off your balcony? And they're hoping you're going to buy the place, even though I haven't got a pre-approved mortgage yet. But that's one way to kind of get inside.
That's a great hot tip for photographers, Vik. Guys, a question has come up about your thoughts on the Spadina subway house.
The entrance up Spadina there.
I believe. Yeah,
it's really neat. It's that's a really interesting adaptation of like an old Victorian house there that's been basically gutted into basically a stairwell. It's pretty neat. I have to say I'm not a fan of the quilt art that is behind the glass in that entrance. It was very much of the time, and it was done by a prominent textile Canadian artist. I can't remember who it is off hand, but it hasn't aged well. It's a 40-year-old blanket that's sitting behind a glass screen or glass wall right now, and I think maybe we could do something a little bit updating there, but maybe not.
I like that building too, but it does bring up the other fact that when you take that building to go down to the platform, that's another huge world of modernism. I mean, the entire subway is kind of an ode to modernism, except for the stations where they've started to change the tiles and stuff. And forgive me for saying this, but I find contemporary architecture to be very, very in these days. And I think that's a sad thing.
Well, it's I think certainly the photos you've got in this book, the examples that are being discussed here, they certainly stand out. There's a question or a commentary that's come up here. I gotta ask it, and we were talking about different kinds of civic classes of buildings before, and the questions from John around which of these buildings or classes of buildings face the biggest threat of demolition, and there's a follow-up question: what done?
Well, it is a great question, and I think the city did a recent study on decrease of like church spaces as community. It's when they go away, community spaces go away. They're usually free or cheap. They're usually they're easy to access. So I think that's something that's really under threat. I think Phil, probably as a professional in this world, you probably have a better idea of those things that are under threat. And I know, but Vik also does a fair amount of research on this stuff too, so he may.
I think that I think one of the important buildings are the low rises. I think they're under threat. They're not that hard to demolish. They're easy to take down. I feel like tall buildings are a bit of a job to take down, but I would say that the mid rises. I guess churches are at risk too, but I've noticed that a lot of churches might be abandoned by one congregation only to be taken over by a smaller congregation. They might have a Montessori school in there. They might have daycare. So I feel, and I'm hoping that people can see the value of a modern church because they're so unique. It's not hard. You don't have to look hard to see why they're beautiful.
I would agree with that. It's funny, we were someone asked about what the Noli plan, if any don't know, but it was a map from I guess 17th century Rome, where the public space, the public realm was mapped in a kind of figure ground technique, and in that mapping, all of the church spaces were rendered as open space, so they were part of the public realm. And you like to think that the solution to many of these at-risk buildings, like churches, like places of worship, which are, to your point as well, really important spaces and important amenity in the city, more so now than ever. But I have to say, as someone who's adapted and reused churches, they're probably one of the most difficult buildings to adapt and reuse. Like, we like to promote, Vik, in future buildings and buildings we're building today as loose fit as possible. Who knows what needs will be and how that will, evolve over the next 50 to 100 years. When we look back to buildings that are easier candidates to adapt from, it's usually those loose fit ones, the warehouse type buildings. They're the easiest to conceive of in that kind of post and beam construction. Think about a church, how specifically, uniquely designed and targeted that function is, and often the structural solutions, the building system, particularly from this era, which again, we're almost like, I don't want to say a kit of parts, but it was a system. It wasn't just one material. It wasn't just a stone wall that is 2 feet thick, which transitions up to a 1.5 foot thick wall built of, brick and lath and plaster. These are material systems that have, 5 or 6 different layers in an assembly. And, they have different age rates and perform very specific pieces. I think that building type itself and with this technology is probably, arguably, I agree, is one of the most vulnerable. The question about what can be done, I think is, well, this conversation is step number 1, right? Like, let's educate ourselves. Let's understand the value of this thing. Let's all agree that there's some shared sense of this. These are valuable assets in our community, and then let's understand what's so important about them. Let's really dig into it and try to imagine if we were going to change them, if we were going to adapt them, what is it about them that we hope to preserve, to conserve, and see in the kind of their future reuse. I actually wondered how many of these buildings were actually listed or designated that are on this, Matt. And I note that it wasn't really spoken about, but some of these I know are not on the list or aren't protected.
I don't think many. Most of them aren't on the list. There's some good examples because they're institutional places. I think the North York Board of Education, for instance, is protected. Maybe it isn't, but I think a few of those types of places are. But we have like in the brutalist section or maybe the infrastructure one. We have a warehouse in Mimico. It's like a no-name warehouse, but it's just really nice and beautiful. And I think that's kind of what I love about Vik's work is that he's kind of like he's somehow wandered into the industrial warehouse streets of Etobicoke and Scarborough and North York and those places and found some really great examples of buildings that were built with one purpose in mind, and some of them are still doing those exact same things, and some of them are obviously are being modified to many different things. And I think that's how manufacturing has really gone away. So those buildings are taking many different shapes. Some of them, like in Don Mills, for instance, there's like some high tech places that have taken over some of those warehouses. So, and I think that's also what's interesting about a lot of these mid-century buildings is that the next generation of people looking for cheap or big or different spaces aren't going to, in the mid 90s, early 2000s, we were looking at, Leslieville and Liberty Village as places where you could still get some cheap studios and places like that. Now it's going to be, I think, in the inner suburbs, and it's going to be some of those older warehouses and those kind of places that are going to be the new band rehearsal destination places and those types of things.
I just wanted to quickly say that a great number of the buildings are not protected. You're absolutely right. And I hate to be cynical, but sometimes I wonder what heritage designation really does offer, because I've seen a lot of buildings in Toronto turn into facades that were designated. That's an aside thing. And the other thing is just, if you look at what we're building today, a lot of it is inspired by modernism. So if we don't protect where our inspiration came from, it's kind of be a huge gap in history. I mean, I think a lot of contemporary buildings, York University comes to mind, they're using a lot of modernist ideas.
Vik, I really appreciate that comment, because I gotta say there's something about our techniques to conserve, our techniques to sort of preserve and manage these things. What I'm noticing is to do it for a modernist building, we're actually doing something different just by the nature of, again, what I'm solving for, what the building types were, how these systems work. I think what we're starting to see the outcome and conservation techniques are different than what we're seeing with, say, you mentioned a facade retained building, which, I can imagine was probably part of a street fabric, part of a street wall condition. It had demising walls. And in fact, in some cases it was, the building that had a principal facade that was probably the most important, or had questions and discussions and ideas around design about how they're getting integrated is an ongoing and extremely lively discussion. But I gotta think we're gonna learn some new tips and techniques, and actually have, and maybe hopefully have, some different outcomes with modernist buildings, which are like mainly like they're very different buildings. So many of these buildings in the book, they're not necessarily fabric of the of the city that we know of, the Victorian city, where they're they're contextual in a way that is quite different than the contextual fabric that they express. Many of these they're objects. They're standalone, not just a single face. They actually have us and a scale and a relationship that often complemented by landscapes. And I know here someone had a comment about modernist landscapes, and also maybe, Matt, one of your next books for you and Vik to think about is some postmodern analysis and consideration. Have you thought about postmodern? Like, is that a debate? Are they old enough to be back in fashion, Matt?
I don't think so yet. It's what I still have some disdain for them, but give me 10 years and maybe I'll find them charming at some point. But you gotta recognize that there is lots of value in those things. You look at like Mississauga City Hall. I know it's not in Toronto, but like that's a fantastic POMO building out there. Vik and I have talked about doing other books together. Maybe cross our fingers we can do that. There could be a volume 2 of the book without being much. Well, Vik is already all the work. He's done a lot, but we will be able to we could slot them in and do another one quickly. It's just it takes a little bit of time to kind of put these together.
I am looking at postmodern buildings now. My first impression of them was, who cares? No offense to anyone who does like them, but again, the more you look, the more you start to see patterns, correlations, what they were trying to do. Some part of me is becoming a little more softer about things like, fake Roman windows and buildings, and, just using colored stone to represent a lintel. There are some good examples. I think that would go really good in a postmodern, ugly buildings of Toronto type book.
But which modernist building in the city of Toronto, and Matt, I know you've mentioned a couple already, but there's somebody on the line here who's extremely skeptical of the beauty that lies in this era. How do we convince them?
I would take him to Lord Lansdowne Public School, at Spadina College. Just what a fantastic kind of it's playful. It's about education, and it's what a kind of unique and an amazing space. I had another one here, but now it's already slipped my mind. Now I feel kind of stupid about that. But that would be that Lord Lansdowne would be something I would certainly take someone to try to twist their arm.
When I think of modern buildings, there's a mid-rise just off Avenue Road, south of St. Clair, 2 blocks south on the east side. It's called the Americana Apartments. That has my favorite space age entrance. Every ornament, every detail in that building is spectacular, and someone's done a really good job. I know we haven't talked about this much, but I'm a huge fan of concrete. So the more bulky and monolithic and brutalist it gets, the more inclined I am to go out there and visit them. But I would recommend just, maybe get a copy of this book, and the addresses are there. The names of the buildings are there. Go take a look for yourself. These are only, there's only one viewpoint of each building in the book, but there's so much more to see. And just go look. If you look at enough buildings, I think you'll generate an appreciation for it.
Great. So, I think there's been some great discussion and debate here. I'm gonna say that there's probably only time for one or two more questions, and I do want to just make a note here. There's a comment just around some of the great work that has already been done, like what we're all here to talk about tonight. Many folks have mentioned North York Modern. The city of Toronto has been doing various surveys throughout the city. This is all sort of front of mind for quite a few people, not just at the city, but volunteers within the community, and certainly academics and city builders like Vik and Matt. So I just, this is building on, I think, what seems to be, an evolving collection of works that are specific to just Toronto. There was a question here, and I want to ask, and I was saving it to the end because I think it's a great one. Is there something different about Toronto modernist architecture that is distinct from of Toronto that you wouldn't have about a modernist era in Chicago or New York from your travels, from either of your experiences in other cities? Is there a Toronto modern experience specifically, or is it something that is an era that exists in many cities across your experiences?
I think, I don't know if there's Toronto, because so many of those architects that came in mid-century Toronto weren't actually born and raised in Canada. They were born and raised in Europe or England, so many of them. So what I find interesting is, like, when I do go to places like Ottawa, or some of the more kind of like Guelph or even Kitchener, Waterloo, they have tons of these kind of buildings that feel kind of very evocative of where I grew up in. So there was so much building, there was so much growth in the baby boom and the era, that there are, you can go to a lot of parts of Canada and feel very at home in it, because the architecture is very, very similar. Part of that is developers, part of that is the Canadian Mortgage Corporation, stuff like that. I think the types of houses that were being built at the time and the plans, it was, you could build very similar houses all over North America, because they're just selling plans. Developers were selling plans. I think in Ottawa, the area I talked about, Elmville Acres, looks like it bought plans for California, because half of the area has no garages. And if you've ever been to Ottawa, you need a garage like you wouldn't believe in the winter. So places like that.
Great.
For me, the whole aesthetic of modernism seems to want to move away from history. And so it wouldn't surprise me if there's not any local influence in a lot of the buildings. From my travels to Hamilton, Ottawa, Calgary, I find it difficult to distinguish between local flavors of modernism. One thing is that no matter where you go, there are so many examples of modern buildings, and I feel like I've just touched the surface. There's probably a million more buildings I need to capture somewhere.
Great. Well, that's your next challenge then, Vik and Matt. So listen, thanks so much for all the great debate and the discussion. And I think, Leslie, if you wanted to sign us off, I think.
I want to ask some questions.
Oh.
I've got very good questions for you, actually. I think and then I'm going to sign off.
Sure.
But okay, the title Remnants suggests that we've lost some notable mid-century built heritage, and to my mind, I think of John C. Parkin's Beta headquarters and the Davisville School. Just those come to mind immediately. Are there others that we should mourn?
I feel like maybe Regent Park is a really good example for things to mourn. I, don't get me wrong, it's great that they're building new housing there, and that's really good. But I mean, effectually, they're going to raise the entire Regent Park as it was before. And there's a lot of early modern buildings there. There's Peter Dickinson's two-floor towers. Every apartment building was 2 floors. The elevator stopped only every other floor. That to me was a massive loss. I think those were my favorite modern high rises in the city. So I would say Regent Park has lost a lot, although it's gained a fair bit.
Thank
If
you.
I was to identify anything, it would probably be the loss of modern homes in residential neighborhoods like in North York and Etobicoke and Scarborough that have been torn down for the kind of the god awful cookie cutter McMansions that have gone up. I understand those are some of those are actually a lot more dense. They can probably house a lot more more people, families. Some families are, they need that, but there's been way too many excellent examples of modern homes that have just been demolished for really, I would say, some pretty awful residences.
Of course, Davisville Public School deserves another mention, because
Mhm.
that was a spectacular building. I understand the TDSB's challenges in using the building. And sadly, if you look at what's there now, it's a monstrosity. I can't stand that building. I apologize for the strong feelings there, but Davisville was a real loss.
Along a similar line, I wonder, among the surviving mid-century modern buildings in Toronto, have any been repurposed, thereby preserving some of their embodied carbon? At a time when we are concerned about greenhouse gases, repurposing buildings, reusing materials is very important.
That's
Anything that you can think of?
Yeah, that's a great question, Leslie, because with many of these modernist buildings, and just think about, Vik, your comment about the bigger, the brutalist building, the better, the idea of, using concrete to the way in which they were using it back then. There's pretty substantial carbon emissions that are occurring there. So there certainly is some carbon, there's certainly a carbon issue there. Just to go back, I was really fond of the Bata Shoe offices up in Don Mills there, that was replaced by the Aga Khan, which we enjoy the museum, the cultural center there, quite a bit. But it's I do mourn the loss of that, but I also do appreciate how it's continued to be part of our expanded cultural experience of the city. I think we're going to see a lot, or hear a lot, and debate quite a bit more embodied energy in buildings. I think it's going to become certainly a factor in managing not just heritage buildings, but all buildings as a kind of larger idea of resources. So it's certainly, I think, on quite a few, not just for conversation around the dinner table, but it's certainly a discussion within the building practice, and it's limited, it's finite material and resources. We've only got what we got, right? So make the best use of it that we can.
I know there was an office building in Midtown that got converted to condos. I can't remember where, maybe Davisville or somewhere around there. But I think that's a rarity. And I also think that the buildings that are kind of under threat from this era aren't built in the old city of Toronto, where so much of heritage preservation is focused. So I think that is a challenge too, is having the people that are willing to go to bat for places in Etobicoke, North York, and Scarborough, and also building constituencies out in those neighborhoods that can value and fight for those. And there shouldn't be a bunch of downtown people telling Scarborough people that you should save building X, Y, and Z because we think it looks pretty cool.
Really quickly, I wanted to add there's a residence apartment building. I don't know if that's the term, on Greenwood Avenue, south of Bloor on the west side. It looks just like a school, but it's apartments now. I want to verify if that is reuse. Another quick thing is, if you look carefully around downtown, if you look at the tops of the mid-rise buildings, you'll notice that a lot of those buildings were reclad. And there's several of them. One that comes to mind is the hotel at Dundas and Sherbourne on the northeast corner, which is now gone. But that was a modernist building, a spectacular looking one, before they put that crappy stucco on there.
Oh dear. Well, we're finding this hard to end, but I'm afraid we're going to have to. I would like to thank you again, Vik, Matt, and Philip, for tonight's discussion, and thank our participants for some wonderful questions as well. I just want to put a little pitch in. Don't forget to buy your copy of Remnants of Mid-Century Toronto at Spacing's online store at spacingstore.ca. And as a special offer for attendees of this webinar, those who purchase a copy of the book from Spacing before the end of the month, January 31st, will receive an edition signed by both Matt and Vik. If you enjoyed this event, please be sure to sign up for Heritage Toronto's other upcoming virtual and in-person programming. You can also find out about upcoming events on our website at heritagetoronto.org under What's On. Heritage Toronto has celebrated Toronto's mid-century modern architecture with plaques. Keep an eye out for the following as you walk around: the Oculus Pavilion in Humber Park, the McNeil House, Eric Arthur's home, and the City Park Apartments. If you believe in the importance of engaging with our past and share our passion for Toronto, please take action and join our circle of donors. You can make a donation or renew your support today at heritagetoronto.org. And thank you again for joining us. And we hope to see you at another Heritage Toronto event. Good night.